This video is brought to you by Imprint. With trade deals with some 74 international partners, the European Union has one of the largest networks of trade agreements in the world. Despite this though, the EU has apparently lost its trade mojo, with a prospective deal with Australia collapsing, a long-awaited deal with Mercosur still out of reach, and negotiations with India and Indonesia facing stumbling blocks. So in this video we're going to explain why the EU is seemingly bad at making trade deals. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So let's start with a bit of context. Trade deal negotiations are actually carried out by the European Commission once they receive authorization and directives from the Council of the EU. Once the Commission strikes an agreement with the other negotiating party, the deal will be presented to both the Council and European Parliament, who examine it and decide whether to give it the required approval. If the trade deal is a so-called mixed trade deal, and most are, i.e. it covers issues over which EU member states retain responsibility, then the agreement can only be fully implemented once each EU country ratifies and signs it. This brings us to the first and probably most obvious reason as to why the EU struggles with trade deals. It's not an easy task to get 27 individual countries to agree on something, as they all have varying interests and political contexts. A prime example is the EU's prospective trade deal with Mercosur, the South American bloc comprising Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay and Uruguay. The deal, which would create one of the world's largest free trade zones, has been in the works for 25 years and has still not been clinched, exposing numerous rifts within the EU. Germany, for example, is a strong supporter of the deal and wants to see it concluded quickly, as it would open up Mercosur's protectionist market to European goods like cars and machinery, a rich opportunity for Germany's export-oriented economy. On the other hand, France has held up the deal's progress due to staunch resistance from France's powerful farmers' lobby that fears being undercut by a flood of agricultural goods from big South American producers. On top of intra-European disagreements, things get even more complicated when national and even some regional legislatures have to ratify an agreement. Take CETA, the EU's trade deal with Canada, for example, which was finalised in 2014. It took until 2017 for the Council and European Parliament to give it the green light, but 7 years later it remains provisionally in place and yet to take full effect, as only 17 of 27 national parliaments have actually ratified it. The reality is, signing free trade deals has become politically toxic in a range of constituencies, and that encourages national leaders and parliaments to oppose such deals. It's not just about pleasing French farmers and German car makers though. Add to the list climate activists, unions and human rights groups, and you'll quickly see how reaching a consensus on the national and European level is particularly difficult. Attempts to keep certain groups on side have hampered trade deals not just when the EU debates a deal's approval, but also during negotiations. For example, EU-Australia trade negotiations collapsed last year, as Australia walked away from the talks because it considered the EU's stance on agricultural produce quotas too rigid and protectionist. The next factor to look at is the depth of the EU's prospective trade deals. Far from being solely about trade, the EU's trade policy, in its own words, is also used as a vehicle for the promotion of European principles and values, from democracy and human rights to environment and social rights. In fact, some have gone as far as to argue that the EU's trade policy is the principal instrument of its foreign policy. As such, trade policy is a powerful tool to promote European standards worldwide. But the non-trade objectives can, and have, created stumbling blocks when it comes to striking trade deals. Take the environment and sustainability as an example. Attempts to finally secure the EU's trade deal with Mercosur have dragged on for years, not just because of divisions within Europe, but also because the EU pushed to add additional sustainability clauses to the initial agreement that had already been reached in 2019, something that went down poorly with Mercosur member state governments. Similarly, after the EU adopted a new law banning the import of products linked to deforestation, its trade relations with Southeast Asian nations like Indonesia and Malaysia soured, creating a barrier to trade deal talks. Opposition to the deforestation regulation, as well as the EU's carbon tax on imports, have also contributed to the holding up of a long-delayed free trade deal with India. Now, this is not a judgment on those specific policies or the EU's values-based approach to trade, But it's at least true it's harder to negotiate a trade deal when you're simultaneously trying to convince your prospective trade partner to align with your high-minded political values. Some of the EU's most ardent free traders, like Sweden and Finland, would like to see the EU get back to basics and focus on pure trade deals that aren't necessarily tied to things like an environmental agenda, raising a fundamental question on what the union's trade policy objectives should be. At this point, we should make clear that it's probably unfair to pin all the EU's trade woes on itself. It is, in some ways, a victim of the times. The global appetite for free trade is in decline, and protectionism is on the rise. For example, the last few years have seen notable instances of trade friction between the EU and US, with Donald Trump placing tariffs on European steel and aluminium, sparking retaliatory EU tariffs, and Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act subsidies, which were seen as a threat to European industry. The EU is not a passive player in this global trend either. Last month, it announced tariffs on Chinese-made electric vehicles, raising fears of a brewing trade war. And, as we said earlier, within its own borders, the EU is having to grapple with the fact that striking free trade deals has become sort of politically toxic, with the wave of farmers' protests across several European countries, and rise of populist parties emblematic of what national governments and the Union as a whole are forced to consider. So, what could be done? One of the European Commission's potential strategies, endorsed by some, like Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is to try to sidestep national parliaments by separating trade deals into a main trade section that only needs EU approval, and leaving other things like investment and political cooperation to a separate part that requires national ratification. But this is far from a solve-all trick that can revive the EU's deal-making abilities, and it would certainly face tough opposition, being seen by national parliaments as a power grab by the EU. Fans of TLDR like you care about understanding the world around them. That's where today's sponsor Imprint comes into play. If you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a new way to learn that turns your phone from an attention-sucking device to a tool for growth. You may have heard this before, but unless you've used the app, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in and day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, and quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. Since we last spoke to you about Imprint in September, I've done the philosophy course and am focusing on their course on the science of happiness. People study how to get in shape, how to eat right, and how to advance in their career. Understanding how humans are wired to be happy has been an interesting path to go down that I highly recommend to all of you. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. Plus, if you use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know that you came from us.